They said J.P.Morgan was untouchable, and to be fair, he acted like it. Born into money, built an empire on steel, oil, and blood, and controlled more of America's economy than any president ever did. This wasn't just a banker. This was the man who bailed out the U.S. government, twice. When the country ran out of gold in 1895, who stepped in? Not Congress, not the Treasury, J.P. freaking Morgan. He wired $65 million in gold and practically held the U.S. dollar hostage. And in 1907, when Wall Street was collapsing, who hosted the emergency meeting that saved the stock market? You guessed it. Morgan, in his personal library, puffing a cigar like he owned the oxygen. By 1915, J.P. Morgan wasn't just a financial tycoon. He was a kingmaker, a titan, a man whose name alone moved nations. Presidents begged for his favor. War machines depended on his loans. And the press? Owned by his associates. He didn't just have power, he was power. But this story isn't about the empire he built. It's about the man who tried to end it. With one bullet. Let's rewind. June 1915. The world is at war. Europe's on fire, trenches stretch from coast to coast, and America's pretending to be neutral. But J.P. Morgan? He's not neutral. He's deep in the game. Morgan's firm was chosen by the British and French to act as their official purchasing agent for munitions. That meant billions of dollars in contracts flowing through his hands. Bullets, bombs, uniforms, artillery. While Europe bled, Morgan banked. And not everyone in America liked that. Enter Eric Muenter, or should we say Frank Holt, or maybe even Eric Holt. The man had more names than a spy novel and enough secrets to bury a cathedral. He was a former Harvard professor, smart, quiet, resentful, and very, very dangerous. He believed that Morgan was dragging America into the war for profit. And to stop it, he'd have to spill blood, Morgan's blood. This wasn't some street thug with a grudge. This was a man who had once taught German at Cornell and linguistics at Harvard. But something inside him cracked. Maybe it was grief. His first wife had died under suspicious circumstances. Maybe it was rage. He believed Wall Street's greed would lead to global annihilation. Or maybe it was a desire to make history, no matter the cost. Whatever the reason, Muenter started planning something monstrous. First, he sent a series of letters, rambling, ominous, filled with warnings about America's descent into war. He signed them with false names. He mailed some to senators, others to newspapers. But the real message? That was delivered through violence. On July 2nd, 1915, Muenter planted a bomb inside the U.S. Capitol. Let that sink in. Before domestic terrorism was a phrase, before mass shootings were daily headlines, a man walked into the Senate reception room and left a suitcase filled with explosives. The device detonated around midnight, shattering windows, blowing apart furniture, and terrifying the city. No one died, but that wasn't the point. It was a warning shot. And it didn't stop there. The next morning, while the Capitol was still smoldering, Muenter boarded a train to Glen Cove, New York, where J.P. Morgan's estate loomed like a fortress on the edge of wealth itself. Morgan's mansion, called East Island, was surrounded by gates, guards, and the kind of arrogance only generational wealth can buy. But Muenter didn't care. He had a pistol, he had a plan, and he had nothing left to lose. Disguised as a delivery man, Muenter walked right up to the Morgan residence. He knocked on the door. Morgan's butler answered. Muenter pushed inside, shouting that he had to see the banker, urgently. Inside, Morgan was having breakfast with his family. His wife, his children. The table was set with silver. Crystal glasses shimmered. Then came the gunshots. Muenter pulled out a revolver and fired twice at Morgan, point blank. One bullet struck the financier in the thigh. The other grazed his side. Morgan, 70 years old, half-dressed, bleeding, lunged at the shooter. This part? It's almost too dramatic to believe. J.P. Morgan, the symbol of American capitalism, wrestled his would-be assassin to the floor with his bare hands while his wife and children screamed. The servants piled in. Muenter was subdued. Morgan was rushed to a doctor. And somehow, he survived. Now here's where it gets twisted. Police arrived, and instead of finding a lunatic with a grudge, they uncovered one of the strangest, most disturbing personal histories of the time. Eric Muenter, or Frank Holt, as his legal identity claimed, had faked his own death years earlier after his first wife died suspiciously from poisoning. He vanished from Harvard, disappeared from the academic world, and re-emerged under a new name, living a double life with a second wife and children. But the lies didn't end there. In his confession, Muenter claimed he had planted multiple bombs on ships carrying munitions to Europe, including the SS Minnehaha, a cargo ship loaded with 1,400 tons of explosives. Authorities laughed it off until days later, a fire erupted on that very ship in New York Harbor. Coincidence or confirmation? He said he wasn't trying to kill Morgan, just to injure him enough to stop the war profiteering. But let's be real. You don't shoot a man at breakfast in front of his kids for a press release. This wasn't a protest. This was an execution attempt. And it failed. But what happened next is what makes the story truly disappear from history. Muenter was locked up in the Nassau County Jail. Press reported on the attack. Politicians condemned it. But the deeper details, they started to vanish. The motive was mental illness. The questions about Morgan's war contracts, never investigated. The fact that Muenter accurately predicted a munitions ship fire, ignored. And just days later, Muenter was found dead in his cell. The official report? Suicide. He leapt from the bars of his cell and cracked his skull. Neat, clean, convenient. A man who had threatened war contractors, bombed the Capitol, shot the most powerful banker in America, and claimed there were more bombs out there, just conveniently snapped his neck while no one was watching. No trial, no testimony, no follow-up. But some investigators, even in whispers, said the body didn't match the description perfectly. That his fingerprints weren't formally recorded. That the only witness to his final moments was a jailer who left the profession weeks later and disappeared from public record. If Muenter died, they sure made it hard to prove. And if he didn't, then where did he go? So why does nobody talk about the man who shot J.P.Morgan? Because his story was erased, not just by time, but by design. The Morgan family had the power to kill a headline in its sleep. The government had every reason to keep the attack quiet. They didn't want Americans asking why a former professor would go full revolutionary. They didn't want people wondering whether Wall Street had already picked a side in the war. And they definitely didn't want a trial that could expose how deep Morgan's influence ran. Instead, Muenter was written off as a madman, a footnote, a glitch in the machine. But if that's true, why does it still feel like the story was buried, not forgotten? Because maybe the gunman didn't vanish. Maybe he was erased. And maybe, just maybe, the real question isn't why he shot Morgan. It's what he knew. Let's be real. If you or I planted a bomb in the Capitol, shot the richest man in America, confessed to sabotaging ships during wartime, and then got locked up, we'd be the headline for the next 100 years. We'd have museums, Netflix docs, conspiracy TikToks. But Eric Muenter? Nothing. No trial, no autopsy released, no memorial, just silence. Why? Because the cover-up started before the second bullet even hit the floor. The newspapers said he was crazy, delusional, a lone wolf with a fractured mind. And just like that, the story was sanitized. A lunatic got loose, shot a banker, and died in jail. Move along. Nothing to see here. But that's not the truth. That's the version you feed a sleeping public so they never ask what really happened. And what really happened is darker than any headline would dare to print. Let's unpack what got buried, piece by piece. After Muenter's capture, authorities started investigating his background. At first, it looked like a standard case of a mentally disturbed man with a vendetta. But the deeper they looked, the more things didn't line up. For starters, Frank Holt, the name he'd used to teach at Cornell, wasn't real. There was no birth certificate, no legitimate employment history, no trace of Holt before 1906. That's when Holt married his second wife under a false name, just months after Eric Muenter allegedly died. That's right. The real Eric Muenter was declared dead in 1906 after his first wife died of arsenic poisoning. He fled Harvard, disappeared from public life, and was never heard from again. Until now. So the man who bombed the Capitol and shot J.P.Morgan had faked his death, created a new identity, and taught at Ivy League schools for years, right under everyone's nose. That's not insanity. That's precision. That's espionage-level planning. You don't build an entire second life while raising kids and grading papers if your brain is broken. You do it if you're hiding. You do it if you've got a mission. Now, while the press pushed the insane German professor story, something else was happening in the background. Morgan's political allies were scrubbing the record. Local police were told not to speak to the press. Journalists who tried to follow the prison story found themselves blocked at every level. The notes Muenter left behind, diaries, letters, manifestos, were collected by federal agents and never released to the public. Why? Because those notes didn't just accuse Morgan of war profiteering, they listed names, government officials, business leaders, shipping companies, newspapers. He believed, or claimed to believe, that America's entry into World War I was already a done deal, that Morgan and his circle had secured contracts, manipulated public opinion, and were using the war as a money-laundering funnel for weapons and steel. And the most terrifying part? He might have been right. Morgan's firm, J.P.Morgan and Company, had already secured a secret deal to loan the Allies over $500 million, equivalent to more than $13 billion today, months before America officially joined the war. Muenter's letters mentioned this. His notes described ship cargoes, even routes. When he said he bombed the SS Minnehaha, the government laughed. But then the ship caught fire, just like he said. Coincidence? Or did he know something we weren't supposed to know? And now here's the part they really don't want you to remember. Muenter didn't act alone. That's right. This wasn't some random crackpot with a vendetta. Investigators later uncovered that Muenter had been corresponding with at least 3 other men, names never released, who were suspected of mailing similar bomb threats to war suppliers in 1914 and 1915. But once Muenter was dead, the trail went cold. No charges, no arrests, and the files, lost, just gone, like they never existed. Why would law enforcement bury an open investigation? Why not dig deeper into Muenter's contacts? Because it wasn't just about protecting Morgan's legacy. It was about protecting the entire war machine that fed off men like Morgan, the financiers, the industrialists, the deal-makers behind the curtain. And now, let's talk about that so-called suicide. According to the official report, Muenter climbed to the top of his jail cell, using the bars, dove headfirst into the concrete floor, and split his skull open. Convenient. Especially since the jailer assigned to him had stepped away for an unscheduled smoke break. And the 2 other prisoners in nearby cells, transferred earlier that morning? Oh, and the suicide note? Never released. But the jail supervisor swore it existed. Then, months later, that same supervisor was let go for unrelated reasons and moved out of state. Does that sound like a clean case? Or a cleanup operation? And here's a little bonus twist. The coroner's report was sealed for security reasons. Yes, you read that right. They sealed the cause of death for a man who shot a banker and bombed the Capitol for national security. Not to protect the public, but to protect the system. And if you're wondering, why haven't I heard this story before? Congratulations. That means the cover-up worked. Now listen up, because Uncle Luke's not done peeling the rotten skin off this onion. If you're the kind of person who's tired of history textbooks lying to your face, you're in the right place. If you've ever felt like the real stories are buried on purpose, you're not paranoid, you're paying attention. So here's what you do next. Tap that like button like you're slapping the truth back into history. Smash subscribe so you don't miss the next story they never wanted you to hear. And drop a comment telling me what you think. Was Muenter a madman or a messenger they silenced? Because this rabbit hole goes deeper. Back to the story. In the weeks following Muenter's death, something eerie started happening. Reporters who had covered the shooting stopped writing about it. Newspapers that once ran front-page updates quietly moved on. One of the only journalists who pushed back, a young New York Times correspondent, was reassigned to rural agriculture reporting in upstate New York. Why? Because he had requested documents about Morgan's arms contracts. 3 days later, his access was revoked. Even stranger, the official photographs of Muenter's cell after his death? Never published. The only known image was taken by a janitor who leaked it years later. It shows blood on the ceiling, not the floor. How does that happen from a headfirst dive? And then, there's the body. The burial of Muenter was done in secret. No public funeral, no family present. A rushed cremation ordered by city health officials. No DNA records, no independent confirmation. Some claim the body wasn't even his, that the man who died in that cell was someone else entirely. A fall guy, a body double, someone put in place to end the story. You think that's crazy? Maybe. But ask yourself, if this were any other killer, would there not be books, trials, court documents, legacy stories? And yet Muenter's tale stops cold the minute the gunfire stops echoing. That's not history. That's deletion. Meanwhile, Morgan recovered, barely a scar. His reputation intact. The war profits kept rolling in. The U.S. joined World War I less than 2 years later, and J.P.Morgan's firm made millions. No questions asked, no public apology, no mention in the textbooks. The official record still says J.P.Morgan was the victim of a deranged gunman. But unofficially, he was the target of the only man who ever tried to hold him accountable, and lived just long enough to regret it. Let's say, just for a second, that Eric Muenter didn't die in that jail cell. Let's say the skull wasn't his. Let's say the body cremated without witness wasn't the man who shot J.P.Morgan. And let's say the real Muenter, the fake Holt, slipped out through the back door while the world was watching the front page. Sounds crazy? Then ask yourself, what happens when you shoot the most powerful man in America and live? See, here's the thing about power. It doesn't like public trials. It doesn't like martyrs. It doesn't like a man with a manifesto and receipts. And it definitely doesn't like someone connecting the dots between billion-dollar arms deals and the death toll in Europe. If Muenter had stood trial, you think the press wouldn't cover the part where he faked a Harvard death and bombed the U.S. Capitol? You think war protesters wouldn't have picked up that story and run with it? No. A trial would have made him bigger, maybe even righteous. So instead, they buried him. Or, more accurately, they made him vanish. Because you don't just disappear a man like Muenter unless someone powerful wants him gone. You erase a man when he becomes dangerous to the narrative. And what was the narrative in 1915? That America was peaceful, that bankers were patriotic, that the war was far, far away. Muenter smashed that lie in broad daylight, and after he vanished, everything kept moving, exactly the way Morgan and his circle needed it to. In the months that followed, the U.S. quietly increased munitions exports. More loans flowed from Morgan's bank to the British and French governments. American industries boomed under neutral wartime demand, and by 1917, the U.S. had joined the war, just as Morgan's firm finalized another round of multi-million-dollar contracts. Coincidence? Not if you look closely. And here's where the conspiracy deepens. Muenter was not the only man who tried to expose Morgan's war dealings. In fact, in 1916, just 1 year later, another man, Louis Seibold, a journalist for the New York World, tried to publish a detailed expose on the war profiteering racket. That article? Never published. Seibold? Reassigned. His editor? Fired within the month. The printing plates for the story? Melted down. But leaked copies later circulated among anti-war activists. One of those copies referenced a source with initials F.H., Frank Holt. That's Muenter's alias, a dead man. Or maybe not. Think about it. What if Muenter continued leaking documents from underground? What if the man who died in jail actually became a ghost, working behind the scenes to unravel the very empire he failed to destroy with a pistol? It's not just a theory, because in 1917, a radical anti-war group known as the Sons of Liberty released a manifesto warning about a shadow financier with blood on his bonds. The language matched Muenter's old letters. The threats mirrored his warnings, and the group claimed to have insider intelligence from a former professor. The U.S. government classified the group as extremist, but no arrests were made, and they vanished just as suddenly as they appeared. Now here's the creepiest part of all this. In 1921, a government warehouse in Brooklyn caught fire. Inside, thousands of sealed records from World War I procurement offices, many tied to Morgan's banking syndicate. Investigators said it was faulty wiring, but some of those documents had just been declassified, and one of the clerks who handled them claimed he found letters, unsigned, undated, accusing Morgan of arranging backdoor shipments of weapons to both sides of the conflict. Both sides, that's right. The theory wasn't just that Morgan helped the Allies. It's that he helped fund everyone, including companies later accused of supplying material to the Germans through neutral nations. It was capitalism without borders, death as a business. And Muenter? He saw it early. That's why he bombed the Capitol. That's why he planted a device on a weapons ship. That's why he tried to kill Morgan in front of his family. Not just to send a message, but to shock the American public awake. And when he failed, they didn't just kill the man, they killed the truth. But what if I told you the truth didn't die? What if it just went dark? There's one last piece of this story they never explain. Not in textbooks, not in archives, not in sanitized documentaries. After the Morgan shooting, after Muenter's suicide, after the case was closed, one of the detectives involved in the investigation went rogue. His name was William Manson, and in 1924 he published a private memoir called The Banker's Bullet. It was never released to the public. Only 20 copies were printed. Most were destroyed, but one surfaced in a private collection in 1989. And inside it, a handwritten note. It read, "He didn't die in the cell. I drove him to the train." That's it. No signature, no context, just a bombshell. Some say it was fake. Some say it was the detective trying to sell his story. But one of the book's readers, a Yale historian, believed it, and he spent the next 10 years trying to prove it. He traced Muenter's handwriting, compared the sealed prison records to known aliases, and even claimed he found passport records showing a Holt F. Erickson emigrating to Argentina in 1916. You want to guess what that man listed as his profession? Linguist, professor, translator of German texts. But the trail ends there. Argentina, a haven for runaways, mercenaries, spies, and exiles, became the perfect graveyard for a man who needed to disappear. And if Muenter made it there, then J.P.Morgan didn't just survive an assassination. He was outplayed by a man who lived in the shadows and maybe never stopped fighting back. So here's what we're left with. A banker too powerful to fail, a shooter too smart to stay dead, and a history so warped we only get to see the version polished for textbooks and museums. But now, you've seen the cracks. You've seen what happens when you pull the thread on the biggest names in American finance. You don't get answers. You get silence, and that silence? That's where the real story begins. So next time someone says, history doesn't lie, ask them about the man who shot J.P. Morgan, then ask them why they've never heard of him. Because in the end, Eric Muenter might not have changed the world with a gun, but he did something far more dangerous. He made the world look in the mirror and blink.